Welcome to session 22, part A. We're now in chapter 13 of the textbook, the chapter on money. And by the way, we're going to do two sessions on this chapter. Okay. In the past, there's been a chapter two which I said I thought I wasn't as good as the other chapters. This is the opposite. I think this may be the best chapter in the entire book. And so in the past, I've said concentrate on the videos. You don't really have to read, at least unless you want to get an A plus. Not true with this chapter. I think this is really, really good, and I encourage everyone to read the chapter. The authors have really done a really good job. Put some interesting anecdotes, interesting theory, and their stuff. Even though I'm an economist, I've got my PhD almost 30 years ago. There's some stuff I learned from this chapter. Okay, in this part A, I'm just going to give some kind of motivating examples. I'm going to tell a couple stories, and just to try to motivate why this chapter might be interesting. First, before I do that, let me pause 1 second. Just explain once again. Last chapter we talked about it's part of macroeconomics. Same for this chapter. This is all about money supply, inflation. Those are all macroeconomics topics. So that's what we're on. Okay, so one little motivating thought to get you interested in this chapter is the following question, and I've heard this all the time from people who are not trained in economics. They'll say, look, why do we have taxes? The government can print money. Why didn't the government just print enough money to pay for all the government services? Wouldn't that be great? The answer is, if you do that, you're quickly going to get inflation, lots of inflation, like massive amounts of inflation. Two examples of this. One is Venezuela. So it's now, as I speak, it's November 2020. The country of Venezuela is just a basket case. They've had something like a 60% drop in their GDP. And one way they've responded is just to print money. Okay, that's what they've been doing, and they currently are experiencing something like 100% inflation per month. Okay, so that means you take the price of any good, wait a month, it will double. Okay, that means something like every day it's going up a few percentage points. It is so much. If you have some money to spend in Venezuela, it's better to spend it at the beginning of the day rather than the end, because prices are going to go up in between that time. So Venezuela is pretty bad. Even worse, maybe the worst example of inflation ever was Germany just after World War I, something early 1920s. What had happened, Germany had just lost World War I. The Allies, I think it's the Treaty of Paris, one thing they did is they imposed reparations on Germany. Germany is going to have to pay money to other countries. And the way they're going to finance this, basically, was just to print money. And so when they start printing money, this caused inflation to go up. And in fact, the inflation was so bad that in 1 year, prices didn't just double, didn't just go up 100 times, 1,000 times. So, by the way, in Venezuela, that doubling every month, that'll get you something like 4,000 times after a year. In Germany is worse. It was something like prices in a year went up 1 billion times. It was so bad, so they're printing money, that money just becomes more and more worthless. It was so bad, there were stories about people carrying in a wheelbarrow full of their paper currency just to pay for groceries. It was so bad that at one point, the money just becomes more and more worthless, so they have to start printing bigger and bigger denominations for their bills. And at some point, the German government was printing bills that were worth 50 trillion marks. These were 50 trillion. Okay, it's so bad. So that's what happens when you just want to print money. You print more and more money. You get inflation. The book doesn't talk about this, and it's beyond the scope of this course, but there's something called the quantity theory of money. And hope you'll take further classes and learn about that. But what it basically says, though, is that if you increase your money supply, if you start printing money, you increase your money supply by 10%, it's going to cause prices to go up 10%. Increase it 100%, prices go up 100%. It's almost a one-to-one correspondence with how much money is, what prices are. Now, two little stories I want to tell you before we get into some of the more substantive topics in the chapter. One comes from a fellow professor in the George Mason department. His name's Cesar Martinelli. Professor Martinelli, when he was, I think sometime around in his 20s, I think it was just after he finished his undergrad degree, he worked as a junior economist in the Peruvian, their equivalent of the Federal Reserve. It's their central bank, and it's the one in charge of printing money, basically. And at the time, the government of Peru was printing money like crazy. Okay, and he said, Cesar, the professor, Professor Martinelli, said, yeah, one day the president actually came to our office. He showed up, and we'd been printing money like crazy, and, the quantity theory of money says you're bound to have inflation, but we hadn't had it yet. And the president said, no, it looks like this quantity theory of money, he actually used the word monetarism, beyond the scope of this class, don't worry about what those words mean. He said, it looks like those theories don't apply to Peru. We can print money, and we don't have to worry about inflation. And sure enough, about a week later, he just had massive inflation. Now, I wrote on Dropbox, I gave an extra assignment. One was to watch a video from Talladega Nights, the comedy movie starring Will Ferrell about the NASCAR driver. And if nothing else, I want you to remember that your professor made you watch that scene, and somehow your professor could relate that to money supply. And the ideas in that scene, Will Ferrell's the race car driver. He thinks he's paralyzed. His friends are telling him he's not. And he tries to prove to them that he's not paralyzed, so he stabs himself in the leg. And my favorite part about that scene is he stabs himself in the legs, looks at his buddies, and does this expression, does his hand like this, does like that, does a look on his face like, look, no pain. And then 2 seconds later, he's in agony. Okay, that's kind of the idea. What happens when you print massive amounts of money? There's no pain at first. Wait a week or 2 or 3, then you get the pain. It's the inflation. Okay. So that's story 1. Story 2. There's a professor at University of Chicago. His name's Randall Krosner. He used to be one of the governors in the Federal Reserve. Okay, this is the U.S.'s central bank. By the way, in the book, actually, they didn't mention that. The book calls the Federal Reserve the Fed. The economists use that lingo, so you should know when I say the Fed, that means the Federal Reserve. So Randall Krosner was one of the governors of the Fed. I think it's something like 20 people that are on this board that make these decisions, like what's going to be the money supply, how large is the money supply going to be in the U.S., which has an effect on inflation. And my friend Randy says we're at coffee one day, and I'm asking him, started to ask him stories about that. And at one point he says, I just can't quite wrap my head around the fact that I can just change some line on a ledger statement, and all of a sudden that will increase the money supply in the United States by $10 billion. I can do that with just the stroke of my pen. And he said, I know we do it, but I still can't quite wrap my head around the fact that how we can do that. And that's an important point. So we'll talk about this during this chapter, in this session and the next, how when we usually talk about money supply, often we think about just the printing of money. You print more dollar bills, say. But it's more complicated than that. And it involves things that the Federal Reserve can do. They just change a line on a ledger statement. Basically, they give a commercial bank, a private bank, say all of a sudden, we're going to put this line which says you now have more deposits with us, the Federal Reserve. And just by doing that, which one of these Federal Reserve Board governors can do, that increases the money supply. Okay, we'll get to more detail about what that means in sessions B, C, and so on. Okay, so that was A, session A. See you in, that was part A. See you in part B.